Samira lived a quiet and peaceful life in a small town in the United States, near the Mexican border. She was 25 years old, a Muslim woman from Mexico who had moved to the U.S. with her husband, Hassan. Their life seemed idyllic. Samira had married Hassan a few years earlier, and since then their world had revolved around their small, modest home on the outskirts of town. Hassan, a mechanic, worked long hours at a local garage, while Samira worked at a small grocery store, content with the simplicity of her life. She was proud of the life they had built together, surrounded by their modest belongings and the warmth of their home. They had no children yet, but the future seemed filled with promise. Despite the simplicity, Samira and Hassan shared a deep love for each other. Their bond was quiet, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. They spent their evenings in the house, cooking together, talking about their day, and sharing simple moments that made their life feel full. Samira, having left behind her family in Mexico, felt a sense of connection only to Hassan in this foreign land. The cultural differences didn't weigh heavily on them. In fact, they embraced them, finding comfort in their rituals and faith. Samira wore the hijab, and Hassan, though not as devout, always supported her in her choices. He loved her deeply, and they had a rhythm to their days, a routine that brought peace. The town they lived in was quiet, with few distractions, and their days were predictable. Samira often woke up early to prepare breakfast, then went to work, where she would interact with customers, some of whom had lived in the area for years, while others were transient, passing through the town for work or other reasons. The people she met were mostly kind, but the life they lived seemed distant from hers. When she came home, she and Hassan would sit together, often in silence, but it was the kind of silence that was comforting, not uncomfortable. They had dreams, like all young couples, of one day expanding their family, moving to a bigger home, and perhaps traveling to visit her family in Mexico. But these dreams were always kept simple, without the pressure of grand ambitions. They were content with what they had, focusing on their love for each other and the small joys of life. This peaceful existence, however, was about to be shattered. One morning, Samira's life took a dramatic turn when, by mistake, she was arrested. It started as a routine check. Someone had tipped off the authorities about her immigration status, and although she had been living in the country for several years, her papers were not in perfect order. The situation escalated quickly. She had always tried to keep a low profile, never drawing attention to herself or her background. But this time, the mistake was fatal. The officers, unfamiliar with the nuances of her case, arrested her, believing her to be an illegal immigrant. Hassan was left in shock and confusion, unable to grasp the sudden change in their lives. The arrest was a misunderstanding, but the damage had already been done. Samira was taken to a local detention center, and Hassan was left behind, unable to help, powerless in the face of an unjust system. Samira's world, which had once felt safe and stable, suddenly felt cold and unfamiliar. The life she had known, built on routine and love, was now far behind her. As she sat in the sterile, cold confines of the detention center, she couldn't comprehend the gravity of what was happening. The peaceful life she had known seemed like a distant dream, fading as quickly as it had been built. As the days passed, she waited anxiously for a resolution, clinging to the hope that the truth would come to light. But the more time she spent in this new, harsh reality, the more she realized that her life would never be the same again. Her quiet existence, her deep love for Hassan, and her simple dreams had been taken from her in an instant, leaving her in a strange and frightening place where nothing was familiar. The walls of the detention center seemed to close in on her, and she wondered how long it would take for her life to be restored to the peace she had once known. But the future, she realized, was uncertain. Samira's arrival at the detention center was nothing like she had imagined. The sterile, fluorescent lights flickered above her as she was led through long, empty corridors. The sounds of clanging doors and distant shouts echoed in the air, a stark contrast to the quiet life she had left behind. The atmosphere was oppressive, the air thick with tension. She was escorted to a small, dimly lit cell that smelled of bleach and stale air. The walls were cold and unforgiving, and the tiny window offered no view of the outside world, only a glimpse of the gray sky above. The other women in the cell were a mix of fear, anger, and resignation. They had all been brought there for various reasons, but the sense of injustice that lingered in the air was universal. Samira sat in the corner, clutching her arms around her knees, feeling the weight of the uncertainty that now defined her life. She was no longer the woman who had once known the comfort of her home with Hassan. She was now just another nameless face in a sea of detainees, waiting for an outcome that seemed far beyond her control. The days blurred together. Time lost its meaning as Samira went through the motions, eating bland meals, enduring endless hours of silence, and speaking only when necessary. She had never imagined that her life would take such a dark turn, that she would be trapped in a place like this, surrounded by strangers, all of them with their own stories of pain and loss. She had become a part of this world, one that had no compassion for her, no understanding of her life before the prison walls closed around her. But in the midst of the desolation, something shifted. Samira began to notice him. The prison guard, an older man with a stern expression and a calm demeanor. His presence was commanding, yet there was something almost gentle in the way he interacted with the detainees. His name was Jack. He was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and a body hardened by years of working in such an unforgiving environment. His eyes, though often distant and guarded, occasionally flickered with an emotion that Samira couldn't quite place. At first, their encounters were brief, exchanges of glances as he passed by her cell, or the rare moments when he was assigned to her section. Samira didn't think much of it at first. She had enough to worry about, focusing on how to navigate her new reality and the uncertainty of her future. But as the days passed, she began to notice the subtle shifts in his behavior. He seemed to linger longer near her cell, as though he were waiting for a chance to speak, to make some kind of connection. Despite the strict rules of the prison, Jack seemed to treat her with a kind of quiet respect. He didn't make her feel as though she was just another criminal to be processed, like so many others in the system. There was an unspoken understanding between them, one that Samira couldn't explain, but felt nonetheless. His presence, though uninvited and unexpected, began to feel like a small comfort in the midst of everything that was happening to her. It was not the kind of connection that could easily be defined, at least not at first. It was something intangible, an undercurrent of emotion that seemed to pulse between them whenever their paths crossed. But as days turned into weeks, Samira couldn't help but notice the growing tension within herself. She felt torn, caught between the deep love she still held for Hassan and the inexplicable connection she was beginning to feel for Jack. It was a dangerous territory, one that she never anticipated. She knew she had no business allowing herself to feel this way, especially under the circumstances. But the isolation and the brutality of the prison had begun to erode her defenses. The attraction she felt for Jack was not something she could easily dismiss, and she found herself wondering if he, too, felt something in return. Her world had been turned upside down by the arrest, and now, in this foreign and hostile environment, Samira was faced with the complexity of her emotions. The prison, which had once felt like a nightmare, was slowly becoming a place where something unexpected was unfolding. She had no way of knowing where it would lead, but she couldn't deny that Jack had become a part of her story, whether she wanted him to be or not. The days dragged on, and as her interactions with Jack grew more frequent, the line between what was real and what was not seemed to blur. Samira found herself questioning everything: her life before the prison, the love she had for Hassan, the life she thought she would have. In this bleak place, where everything seemed lost, something new was stirring inside her. And while she didn't fully understand it yet, Samira knew that this was only the beginning of a much more complicated journey. As weeks passed, the invisible thread between Samira and Jack grew tighter, binding them in a quiet, forbidden dance. Samira couldn't explain what had begun to take root inside her, this feeling that seemed to smolder under the surface, slowly consuming her thoughts. She had spent most of her life sheltered in the confines of a loving marriage, her world uncomplicated and predictable. Now, in the harsh reality of prison, everything had changed. Her heart, once full of devotion for Hassan, had started to be pulled in a direction she never thought possible. Jack's presence, which had started as an unspoken connection, became an undeniable pull. She would feel his gaze linger a second too long whenever he passed by her cell, and the briefest moments of their interactions were charged with a quiet tension. His steady, calm demeanor, the way he carried himself, there was something magnetic about it. It was as if he existed in a different world, one where the rules didn't apply, and Samira found herself inexplicably drawn to him. Jack, for his part, had always maintained a professional distance. He had seen the pain and desperation in countless inmates' eyes over the years, but Samira was different. There was something about her, something fragile, yet powerful, that unsettled him. He had tried to keep his distance, knowing full well the complications that could arise. But every time he saw her, every time their paths crossed, he couldn't ignore the stirring inside him. It was a feeling he had never experienced in all his years working in the prison. The quiet respect he had for her, born out of the way she held herself despite her circumstances, had slowly turned into something else, something he could not suppress. One afternoon, as Samira was returning from the yard, she caught sight of Jack leaning against the wall near the hallway. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a flicker that made her heart race. She quickly looked away, trying to suppress the warmth that surged in her chest. She didn't know what it meant, this feeling that had taken root inside her, but she could no longer deny its presence. Days turned into nights, and their stolen moments became more frequent. There were no words exchanged, only glances. Quick, fleeting moments that seemed to carry a weight far greater than anything verbal could express. Every time Jack looked at her, Samira felt the walls around her begin to crumble. She had spent so much time focusing on the overwhelming injustice of her situation. But now, in the midst of her suffering, she found herself caught in something she couldn't control. Jack's presence, once a small comfort in the monotony of her prison life, had now become something that consumed her. She couldn't stop thinking about him, the way his strong hands would grip the metal bars of the cell, the way his lips would curl into the slightest of smiles when they crossed paths. The attraction she felt toward him was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. She knew the consequences of allowing herself to fall into this temptation. She had a husband, a life outside of this place, and yet, in the prison's cold walls, those things felt like distant memories, like another lifetime. Samira tried to push the thoughts of Jack away, but they persisted, invading her every moment. She felt herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain, as if his very presence filled a void she didn't even know existed. Her loyalty to Hassan, once unwavering, now seemed distant and fragile. The love she had for him felt like a shadow, fading with each passing day. The emotions she had long buried were rising to the surface, and she couldn't control them any longer. One evening, as she sat alone in her cell, staring at the bare walls, her mind raced. She thought of Hassan, of the life they had shared, of the dreams they had built together, and yet in that moment, she couldn't help but think of Jack. She had never been this confused in her life. The love she had for Hassan seemed to pale in comparison to the raw, unexplainable pull she felt toward Jack. It was a forbidden passion, something she knew she could never act on. But it was there, deep within her. The guilt weighed heavily on her chest. She had never imagined her life would lead her here, to a place where she was torn between two men, both so different from one another, both representing completely different worlds. The idea of betraying Hassan, of turning her back on the man who had always been there for her, seemed impossible. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the depth of her feelings for Jack. She was a woman caught between loyalty and desire, between duty and passion, between the life she had known and the one that was unfolding before her. As she lay in bed that night, staring up at the cold, sterile ceiling, Samira knew she was at a crossroads. The path she had been on, the one that had led her to prison, seemed to have split into two directions, one that would lead her back to her old life and the love she had once known, and one that would pull her further into the chaos of desire and forbidden love. The decision she had to make, the path she had to choose, was one she wasn't ready to face. But it was coming, whether she was prepared for it or not. Jack, too, felt the tension between them, the forbidden nature of their connection. He knew the risks, knew the consequences if anyone found out. But the temptation, the overwhelming pull he felt toward Samira, was something he couldn't ignore. He had tried to keep his distance, but it was becoming impossible. Every glance, every shared moment, only seemed to bring them closer to a precipice neither of them knew how to avoid. The lines between right and wrong, duty and desire, had begun to blur, and neither Samira nor Jack knew how to stop it. The days in prison had blurred together for Samira. Her life, once full of promise and hope, had been reduced to a monotonous routine behind cold bars. But the unexpected had happened. After months of uncertainty, the legal system had finally recognized her innocence. A clerical error, a simple mistake that had led to her wrongful imprisonment, was now rectified, and the papers had come through. She was free. Samira stood in front of the prison gates, the weight of her new reality settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had been released, but she wasn't sure what to make of it. The world outside seemed unfamiliar now. The streets, the air, the sounds, everything felt distant. She had been imprisoned for so long that the freedom she once longed for now felt more like a strange and intimidating place. Her husband, Hassan, had come to pick her up, but even as she saw him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. He was still the same loving man, the one who had stood by her, waiting for her return. But Samira felt a gap, an emotional distance she hadn't noticed before. She had been through so much in prison, so much pain, confusion, and internal struggle, that it seemed like she had become a different person. The Samira who had once left her home to follow her husband's dreams felt like a distant memory, someone she no longer recognized. On the way home, Hassan spoke to her gently, trying to make her feel at ease, but his words were like echoes, falling away without reaching her. She didn't know how to explain to him what had happened in the prison, how the emotions she had once carefully guarded had shifted, how the connection she had with him seemed more fragile, more tenuous than before. The tension between them, while unspoken, lingered in the car, as if they were both walking around an unspoken truth. At home, the familiar comforts of her old life awaited her, but the warmth that once filled the house now seemed hollow. She wandered through the rooms, touching the furniture, the pictures on the walls, the things that had once given her a sense of belonging. Everything was the same, and yet it wasn't. The quiet had become oppressive, a constant reminder of the silence that now existed between her and Hassan. She tried to focus on the ordinary things, the small moments that used to bring her joy, cooking, cleaning, spending time with Hassan. But it all felt foreign. She couldn't erase the memories of prison, of the connection she had felt with Jack, the man she had never planned on falling for. Those memories were now like ghosts, haunting her thoughts, making it impossible for her to fully return to the life she had left behind. She knew something had shifted inside her, but she couldn't yet name it. There was a yearning within her, a need for something more, something she wasn't sure how to find. As the days passed, Samira's mind began to drift toward her health. She had been feeling weak, tired, and her body no longer seemed to be responding the way it once had. At first, she chalked it up to the stress of everything she had endured, the trauma of prison, the overwhelming emotional weight of being freed. But when she went to the doctor, the diagnosis hit her like a cold, harsh reality. HIV. The words echoed in her mind, over and over again, as if her brain couldn't fully comprehend them. Samira sat in the sterile doctor's office, her world crumbling around her. The doctor explained the implications, the treatment options, but none of it made sense to her. She had always taken care of herself, had always been cautious. How could this happen to her? The shock of it left her numb, as if her body and mind had disconnected from the reality of the situation. She tried to focus on the doctor's words, but it was all a blur. The overwhelming sadness, the fear of what was to come, clouded everything else. When she returned home that night, Hassan was there waiting for her. But Samira could barely look at him. She could see the concern in his eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. How could she tell him? How could she explain the weight of what she was carrying now, the burden of a future that seemed uncertain and painful? Hassan, oblivious to her inner turmoil, spoke of mundane things, plans for the future, the hope that things would go back to normal. But Samira felt trapped in a reality that had slipped away from her, a reality that no longer fit with the life she had known. The secret she carried was like a shadow, looming over her every moment, and she couldn't find a way to shake it. She began to isolate herself, spending more and more time alone. The house, once a place of warmth and love, now felt like a prison. She couldn't escape the thoughts that consumed her. Thoughts of Jack, thoughts of what she had lost and what she was now facing. She thought about the future, the life she had once envisioned with Hassan, but now everything seemed tainted by the diagnosis that would change everything. The isolation deepened, and Samira became increasingly withdrawn. The connection she had once shared with Hassan now seemed like an illusion, something fragile that had been broken by the cruel twist of fate. Her health, once a source of strength, now felt like a slow decline, a reminder that everything was fleeting. And as the days wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping away from her, piece by piece. But in the midst of this despair, a small part of her still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew that she couldn't keep living in this state of limbo. She needed to find something to hold on to, something that would give her the strength to face the uncertain future ahead. But the burden of her secret, the weight of the life she had left behind, continued to press on her chest. And in the silence of the night, as she lay in her bed, the question that lingered in her mind was no longer just about survival. It was about whether she could ever truly be free again. The days that followed her diagnosis were a blur, each one blending into the next in a haze of exhaustion and despair. Samira had never imagined that something like this would happen to her. And now, as her body began to wither, the weight of her illness became an ever-present reminder of her fragility. It wasn't just the physical toll, though that was enough to break her. It was the crushing sense of loss that accompanied every painful step she took. Her energy, once abundant, was now a scarce resource. She would wake up each morning feeling as though her body had been ravaged by an unseen force. The fatigue settled into her bones, making even the simplest tasks feel impossible. She no longer took pleasure in the small things, cooking, cleaning, the routine of her days. Everything seemed meaningless in the face of what she was now facing. Hassan tried to care for her, as he always had, but the subtle tension between them grew with each passing day. His concern was palpable, but there was also a distance in his eyes. A fear, perhaps, that he hadn't known how to confront before. He didn't speak of it, but Samira could feel it in the way he moved around her, in the way he hesitated when he touched her. It was as though her illness had placed an insurmountable wall between them, a wall that neither of them knew how to scale. Samira had tried to confide in him about the impact of her condition, the emotional burden of living with a disease that was so heavily stigmatized. But her words had always faltered, trapped in her throat by the overwhelming shame and guilt that clung to her. She couldn't bring herself to tell him how her thoughts often drifted back to Jack, how the echoes of their forbidden connection still haunted her, especially now that her body was betraying her in ways she could neither control nor understand. She began to isolate herself more and more. The fatigue, the physical pain, the overwhelming sense of loss. It was too much for her to carry alongside the burden of the secret that weighed on her heart. She withdrew into the quiet of their home, retreating into herself. Hassan, despite his best efforts, couldn't reach her. His words of comfort felt hollow, falling flat against the coldness that had settled between them. He tried to be understanding, but the distance between them seemed to grow with each passing day, like a chasm they could no longer bridge. Samira would spend hours staring out of the window, watching the world go by, but she felt so far removed from it all. The people on the streets, the noise of the city. Everything felt like it was happening in a different world, one that she no longer had access to. It was as though she had become a ghost, a shadow of the woman she had once been. The reality of her illness had become impossible to ignore. It was there in every ache, in every labored breath, in the way her skin had begun to pale and her hair to fall out. Her once vibrant, youthful appearance was slowly being replaced by a gauntness, a hollowed-out version of herself. She had become a prisoner in her own body, and no amount of love from Hassan could change that. And then came the day when everything fell apart. Hassan had found out. He had discovered the truth about her illness, though she hadn't meant for him to. She had kept it from him for as long as she could, but the signs had become too obvious. Her body was no longer hiding the truth. He had seen the way she was fading, the way she couldn't keep food down, the way her once glowing complexion had turned dull and ashen. The confrontation had been quiet, almost too quiet. He had looked at her with those wide, confused eyes, searching for answers she couldn't give him. She could see the pain in his gaze, but there was something else there, too. Something darker, something she hadn't expected. It was a look of betrayal, of disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom how this had happened, how his life had come to this point. He asked her about Jack. She hadn't expected it, but the question hung in the air, thick with accusation. She couldn't lie to him, not anymore. The truth spilled out, painful and raw. How she had fallen for someone else, how that brief connection had changed her, had led her down a path she never intended to walk. Samira had thought that telling him would bring some sort of relief, that finally confronting the truth would unburden her. But instead, it only seemed to deepen the rift between them. Hassan was devastated, not just by her illness, but by the betrayal. The man who had once loved her, who had stood by her through everything, now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The man she had once known was gone, replaced by a man consumed by anger and hurt. The days that followed were filled with tension, silence, and unspoken words. Hassan couldn't look at her the same way. He couldn't touch her the way he once had, and Samira felt every inch of that distance. She wanted to fix it, to undo the damage she had caused, but it was too late. The walls had gone up, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't tear them down. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the inevitable happened. Hassan snapped. His frustration, his anger, his sorrow, all of it came pouring out in a violent outburst. He couldn't handle the weight of what was happening, the weight of her illness, the weight of the lies she had told. In that moment, the man who had loved her with such tenderness and care was no longer in control of his emotions. He had become someone else entirely, someone driven by pain, by the need to make her pay for what she had done. Samira never saw it coming. The blow was swift, a burst of rage that caught her off guard, knocking her to the ground. The pain was immediate, searing, but it was the coldness in his eyes that stayed with her. In that moment, as she struggled to breathe, she realized that the life she had once known was gone forever. There would be no redemption, no healing. There was only the cruel finality of what had transpired. Samira's last breath escaped her quietly, as if her body had finally given up on the world that had betrayed her. And Hassan, standing over her lifeless form, was left to face the consequences of his actions. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain that never came. Hassan stood over her lifeless body, his chest heaving with the weight of what he had done. His hands were trembling, slick with the remnants of a violence he had never imagined himself capable of. The silence in the room was suffocating, as though the world had come to a halt in the wake of the tragedy. He had killed her. The woman he had loved, the woman who had once been his everything, was gone, and there was no undoing it. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, of regret, of disbelief. He hadn't meant to do it. He hadn't meant for things to spiral so far out of control, but the darkness had taken over him, clouding his judgment and choking the remnants of his sanity. His gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes tracing the contours of her pale face, the delicate features now twisted in death. He could still remember the softness of her skin, the warmth of her touch, the way she had once smiled at him as though he were her entire world. That image, so pure and full of life, now felt like a distant memory. It was as if the very essence of her had been erased in an instant, leaving only the coldness of a body that had once been so full of promise and love. He collapsed beside her, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, suffocating him. His mind raced, replaying the moments leading up to this, the words he had said to her, the anger that had clouded his vision. How had it all come to this? How had the love they shared been reduced to this horrifying finality? The tears came slowly at first, as though his body was unsure of how to process the enormity of his actions. But soon they came in torrents, as if all the emotions he had buried deep inside him had finally erupted. His shoulders shook with the force of his grief, and he cradled her head in his lap, rocking gently as though he could somehow undo the violence he had inflicted upon her. But there was no going back. There was no undoing what had been done. Hassan knew that now. The finality of her death hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding everything around him. He had killed her, and in doing so, he had destroyed everything they had built together. All the years of love, of trust, of shared memories, gone in an instant, wiped away by his own hands. As the tears continued to fall, Hassan could feel the weight of his own shame bearing down on him. There was no escape from the consequences of his actions. No matter how much he cried, no matter how many prayers he whispered into the stillness of the room, he could not change the fact that he had taken the life of the woman he once adored. The night stretched on, a seemingly endless void of darkness and despair. Hassan sat there, beside her lifeless form, until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, casting a pale light across the room. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply sat there, lost in his grief, as the world outside continued on without him. There would be no redemption, no forgiveness, only the cold, empty reality of what he had done. And with that realization, a part of him, the part that had once known peace and love, died as well.